running in my mind all the time as I see schools negotiate, but I'm also a founder of Responsible Innovation Project, and we're teaching AI and machines. And so when I watch and my daughter process, I'm a parent as well, process information or media, it really is from multiple angles. And so today, I feel very lucky to have this esteemed panelist. And because my connection is just so interesting, I will say it would be great if everyone could just introduce themselves briefly for a minute or two. And really, if you could just talk about what's one thing that you really is kind of passionate about. So for me, I'm really passionate about the kind of world we're designing for our children and beyond that, and how the stories we tell and how we tell them impact that. So Candace, would you, and welcome.
Thank you, Alka. So it's great to be here. I'm really excited about tonight's discussion. So I am a North Carolina-based writer. I work as a freelance writer, and I also work for a nonprofit in college access to help marginalized high school students find the right college fit. And media has always been something that I've been passionate about, just personally from an artistic standpoint, as well as from an advocacy standpoint. So I've done a lot of petitions. I'm co-organizing one now to try to expand TV and movie ratings to include stereotyping against marginalized groups or different ethnic or cultural groups. And I would say just in general, I think for me, creating positive representations is really important. I always say that I was like a PBS kid. I kind of grew up on like Barney and Sesame Street and Arthur and, you know, a lot of programming that I think really helped to shape the way I view the world in creating like empathy towards other groups and also just like human decency. So for me, I'm a huge advocate of just learning how we can think critically about media and the way that we process it, teaching our kids to do the same, and then also creating content that teaches our youth to just be better people. So super excited to be here.
Thank you, Candace. And really, it would be great for us later when we talk about, you know, the way more and more kids are consuming movies and films and games, and you know how that translates between both of those mediums. So thank you and welcome. Melissa, you're working on all of the exciting and really difficult, tough problems right now with digital access, and we'd love to hear what your focus and what's burning on your mind.
Sure. Let me just start off by saying that I'm an educator. I've been in the education field I've hit that point where I kind of get fuzzy on how many years it's been. It's been over 20. I started off my career as an art educator. So performing arts, the arts in general are just something near and dear to me because of what that does for students and their ability to connect with content and really relate. So, and then as my career has evolved, I have moved into technology within our school district, and then also became part of Common Sense Education and part of the Common Sense organization. So Common Sense is all about looking at media and how to balance it. You know, I think when you're asking about, you know, what's near and dear, especially right now in education, knowing that there is just this kind of almost 24/7 media content at us because of the pandemic. If we're not doing it in our work or in our schooling, we're doing it, you know, in our downtime for entertainment and whatnot. And so coming up with how do we balance that out, and also thinking at it through the lens of not just being a consumer, but also how do we then be a creator, you know, so we're really being innovative and using the technology in ways that aren't just passive, it's more creative with it. So I think that covers about all that I am.
No, thank you, Melissa. And we will really love to talk about how do we not only, figure out, like, how do we give access to our children for delight and fun and sometimes interaction with kids, but do it in a safe and healthy way. So
Absolutely.
look forward to that. And we didn't know what to call you, if you went by Chris or Dr. Willard. So we're just so happy to have you. You've been busy saving us from ourselves, I see. Why don't you introduce yourself, and we look forward to having more conversations.
Sure. So my name is Chris Willard. I'm a clinical psychologist. I do all kinds of different work. I work as a clinician with kids and families. I consult a lot to different schools and organizations. I teach at Harvard Medical School. I try to write, and I loved what you said just a moment ago, Melissa, about not just being consumers, but being creators. And I think that what technology offers us, and hopefully at its best, is a chance to be creators. And unfortunately, it becomes so much about consumption. And I really feel like that as healthy humans, we need to have that right balance between consumption and creation. So I'm really interested in this conversation. And I have to confess also to Alka, I'm a little bit like, I'm excited to be here to talk, but I really want to learn from everybody else too, because it's a great panel. So I'm just excited to be here. A lot of my own work is on self-regulation and mindfulness and social emotional learning for kids. So that's been, acutely challenging during this pandemic, for all kids, but particularly for more marginalized kids who they get their meals at school, and, doing therapy online is really not the same as human contact. And so that's felt important to me as we think just in terms of the pandemic. And then to me, I think what excites me about technology is how can we find ways to have this, of course, be educational, but how can we have this connect us and unite us, right? These are supposed to be communication devices. It's rare that we're like really truly communing with other people. And unfortunately, I think certainly in the adult world right now, we can see how much technology is really dividing us in a lot of ways. And so trying to find kind of a more hopeful future for ways that we can, use some of this for good, really. Technology screens, they're not good or bad, right? It's what we do with them and how we use them, right? They're tools, and I think we have not figured out how to maximize their tool potential, and instead, I think they can be destructive. So I'm just excited to be here. I sometimes do workshops about kids and technology, but I'm excited to learn just as much as I am to share. So thank you again for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I'm on the East Coast, so I realized I'd put on my pajamas, and I was like, oh, I need to actually put my clothes back on and log in for this presentation. So nice to see
no one will be asked to get up from their seats. So however you're dressed, we've all been in those vulnerable positions. So, so Chris, I think one of the things that you pointed out, which would be interesting to come back to, is that, one thing we noticed was the technology was primarily meant, internet and in all its glory, for a certain demographic. Children were, sort of brought in a sort of control group. And with this pandemic, it literally, is staring back at us, because younger and younger generations are going in and they're like, oh, what's this? And they're curious. So they find everything that's on there, and the content is like 3 clicks away. It's very unacceptable. Yeah. So I think that's great. And the next speaker is my favorite. And I hope I'll say your name right, but you're literally keeping our little ones so excited. Ravit and I'll let you sort of speak to what you're working on, but I really, in your intro, if you can point out how you're bringing in this multilingual set of programming and stories from different cultures, which I think is also very important when we talk about content. Ravit, so please introduce yourself.
First of all, thank you for that intro. This is a real privilege to be around such amazing people, and I was super excited when this opportunity came to me. My name's pronounced Ravit. I live in Mountain View. I work at Google. I'm part of the health and performance team at Google. I actually was a massage therapist. I mean, I still am, but because of where the world is right now, we've all pivoted in our own way. And since we do focus on well-being and really focus on empowering people, we still do these move and breathe classes. And essentially what happened after one of the classes is kids started to interact with each other, and kids were also looking for this content. And so out of that came Storytime for kids at home that we do for Googler households. And we make it as inclusive as possible. Also coming from the health and performance team, I usually started off with, let's take 3 slow, deep breaths before we begin this, just so we have some time to transition, because whether we're big kids or little kids, we're usually going from one activity to the other. So it's really nice. And truthfully, sometimes I do it for myself, where I'll just tell everyone, let's take a nice deep breath in, and then and you can see everybody in the room, and sometimes we say, get your wiggles out. We'll incorporate origami or some art projects, and really give kids around the world a chance to connect with each other. It's a lot of silliness, but connection, because depending on the age group of the kids, they are only in classes, or there is a lot of very structured online time, and this gives a lot more of share your favorite stuffed animal, or listen to these stories from around the world. Or since we do have a lot of teammates who do speak other languages and are from such rich cultures, we do try to include it in a lot of our stories and activities. And when you were talking about something that we're focusing on, or something for myself that I think I'm always focusing on, whether it was being a body worker or working with the whole health and performance, is trying to help people find a moment of peace. I truly believe if you have some peace in your heart, mind, and body, you can get through so much, whether it's big feelings or little feelings, but just giving people the power to tap into that has been really powerful. And it's also great to see people of all ages kind of explore that. So thank you so much for having me here, and it's a real honor to be here with everybody. Thank you.
Welcome, Ravit. And I think one of the things that was very interesting about your program is that you started during COVID, which is already an unusual situation, but there's also been this increased awareness about all of our cultural baggage of racism and identity, and the way that you wove in content around skin color and identity in a very gentle and sort of playful way, I think is a really great example, because that's one of the things that I want to explore today is, you know, in my work as well in responsible innovation and with AI or technologies, I put delight first. Because one of the things people think is because you're talking about important stuff, you kind of have to be boring or have to be really like so serious, like you can't, you know, nobody wants to befriend you because you're just going to lecture them. But, you know, how can we arrive to this doing the right thing, whatever that is for different people, with a sense of delight and joy, which children are just wonderful reminders and examples of that. So I wanted to move to the first question, and I'll start with you, Candace, is this part that seems really obvious to me, but it seems to be missing when I talk to a lot of educators even, or parents. Why does it matter what stories we tell our children?
Yeah, it matters so much. I think that a lot of times, especially as adults, like we get away from just how much we understand at a young age and just how quickly children start to pick up on things. I can definitely speak, especially from a perspective of thinking about like racial and gender representations, but this can go for pretty much anything that you can think of in the media. But kids, when they're seeing a screen, like this is their first window to the world, their first interaction of like what social roles are, how we're supposed to act, now dealing with obviously being in a pandemic, even more so because we don't have, you know, the regular human interactions and camps and things that we're involved in. So kids pick up on things really fast. And so if they are seeing things that are negative in their media, that also means that they're learning, you know, by the time that they're getting on the school bus, that something is wrong. You know, maybe that kids see me a certain way based on my race, or girls are supposed to be treated this way and boys make decisions. Those have real life consequences for kids down the line. If you think about it from, you know, a negative perspective, health effects, mental health, anything from anxiety, depression, probably something that Chris knows very well. So when we think about the effects that our media has on kids, that means that the stories we tell them absolutely matters. So I think in the vein of kind of what Alka was saying is that, yes, sometimes we think about it from like the Debbie Downer position, but really we just need to flip that on its head and think about positive reinforcement. So if we can be damaging our kids with certain images, we can also really uplift and empower our kids to be the kind of adults we want them to be by presenting positive images. So when we think about why it matters, it's really that we're shaping the perspectives that kids have on themselves and other people. So if we're really inputting positive media in front of them for all of the hours that they're watching it, then that means that we're contributing to their growth into the kind of society that we're building. So it has real life consequences. And if we're focusing on the positive ones, then we know that we're doing our job.
Thanks, Candace. And Chris, I was wondering if you could build on that, and Melissa, feel free, and Ravit, if you want to jump in, because this is such a, you know, we can be more interactive. But in addition to what we were talking about, why it matters, and even outside of COVID, right? I remember when I was a kid, and the first time I studied this, I read this story about a character called Sita in Indian mythology, who was kind of had to go through trial by fire to prove, you know, her chastity. And I didn't even know what chastity was, you know, when I was young. But it just, I was horrified that not only was it done, but that it's being like, sort of like, no one's saying, oh, that's terrible, and we're not going to do that again. And so the effect that not only reading or being exposed to what's happening, but how other people are reacting to it, maybe normalizing it, can have on children about their worth or their identity. I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to take that, and then Melissa, feel free to add.
Absolutely. I mean, I do feel like the stories that we tell, and even in other media, I mean, to some extent, the games that we play, and having kind of like studied a little bit games in different cultures and subcultures, as well as stories and narratives in different cultures. I mean, they are there to reflect the values of our culture. And they teach kids how to be kids, how to be people, how to be grown-ups, how to, you know, and how to be Americans in some ways, you know, in these different ways. And so, you know, I think to build on what Candace was saying in particular, I just feel like representation in particular is so important. You know, growing up, everyone in books looked like me. I never had to even think about it, you know, until, you know, more, you know, recently, just becoming more awake to just the realization of like how truly important it is for so many people to need to see people who look like them, and all kinds of, you know, all kinds of role models, and who talk like them and sound like them. And so I do feel like, especially in our culture, that is a really, I think, the strength of our country in North America, is our diversity. And so like having, you know, different kinds of folks represented in different ways, different kinds of behaviors represented, you know, this really is where our kids learn our values. And the other thing about stories is that when they're imperfect, also it can be a teaching opportunity, right? And any story can also be an opportunity, whether it's a show, whether it's a book, whatever it might be. There's such good research on the ways that we can build emotional intelligence just by talking about what the shows are that our kids are watching, what happened in them, the books. There's a study that people talk about Daniel Tiger, that's like, Daniel Tiger increases emotional intelligence. It's like, that's true only when the parents have a conversation with the kids about what happened on Daniel Tiger. And then it's actually a magical, incredible show that can do that. Or when we read books to our kids and we say, what do you think this character is feeling? That actually, when kids are young, that actually leads to more pro-social behavior down the road. talking about different characters' experiences, what their motivations might be, you know, the fact that characters have interior lives and motivations, that builds empathy. And to go back to the notion of creating, not just consuming, actually having kids write things like first-person narratives from other people's perspectives, we know that that actually builds empathy and compassion in kids too. So both consuming and creating media and content, you know, content's such a kind of overblown word. Stories is such a better word than content, but that can actually be such a powerful emotional lesson and how to be a really compassionate, caring citizen in so many ways as well. So
thank you, Chris. And Melissa, I was going to add one other layer on it and then give it to you, is that I think what Chris mentioned was, you know, how do we not only look at the why, but also look at content creation so people can reflect, you know, or making stories about them. And two provocations I want to add on top of that. One is, you know, some of the stories the adults have, right? Like Cinderella, I don't understand why we can't get away from that. You know, why is that? You know, I have so many problems with that story, but you know, a lot of these stories brought joy to us as children, or not to me, but other people. And what, you know, so we kind of connect to our own childhood for that. So I wanted to see if you could talk about that. And also in this content creation with children, can we do this thing about bringing this joy of a story they know, but changing not only visually how people look by like calling somebody Sita or giving them a name that's, you know, is not a more recycled or sort of mainstream name. What do you think about both of those, about the value of that?
So I'm trying to wrap my head around the question a little bit. You know, I think coming at it from the education, I'm going back to kind of the original question of why it matters. And I was thinking about how important it is about brain development when we're talking about really young children. And I think about Ellen Galinsky's work around these executive functioning skills. And she talks about, you know, perspective taking and how important that is. And so these stories are one of those ways, like Dr. Willard had mentioned, you know, having the ability for in these online spaces, you know, which our educators are now working with our students, having ways that students can authentically interact with each other in their classrooms. I think that was also mentioned by you, Ravit, about, you know, they're missing that opportunity for these natural ways to interact. And so I think it becomes an important part in the education field, as well as for parents, to really think about how can we nurture some of these skills within those spaces? How can we help our kids take on perspectives, you know, and like it was mentioned too, asking the questions is not just putting something in front of them and thinking it's going to magically do the learning for them. It's that co-viewing with them, it's working with them and having the conversations and bring up the topics that are really important to be talking about in a way that does that. And so I think about that. I think about the critical thinking and how you have to, you know, scaffold things and bring that into mind with it. I'm not sure if that's exactly answering your question.
Everything that you say is great. It's all helpful. We're a short period of time, so we're just trying to put it in. But
yeah,
I think
one other point is, you know, thinking about those different categories of executive functioning, the other one is the making connections. And that's such an important piece in that development of the brain for kids, that we have to help them make those. And that makes me think a lot of the work that I do working with educators is helping them utilize the common sense curriculum that we have, and embedded in that curriculum is what we call thinking routines. And at any point we can help kids start developing these routines at as early age as possible, so that when they're engaging in these online environments and telling their stories to their friends through texting or whatever they're doing, or doing it in some Flipgrid that they're sharing a story, you know, and videotaping themselves or creating a YouTube, however they're doing it, that they embed some of these kind of practices where in the thinking routines are like slowing down and self-reflecting before they do things, you know, helping build that skill, seeking facts before they just react to things, you know, and considering perspectives like we talked about. These are so important, and I think of them very much as we as parents have been so ingrained about teaching certain skills that become kind of what we call muscle memory for our kids, you know, like how they cross the street. We have been doing that since they're itty bitties, so that when they hit that middle school years and they go what I call spaghetti brain, those kids are still stopping and looking both ways. They might still be dashing, but they're stopping and kind of glancing, you know. We want to create that same muscle memory for our youngest learners, so that when they hit those older ages, they just have it naturally part of how they're interacting, how they're telling those stories online, but using those skills that have set that foundation for them. And I think that becomes an important part of the development with our kids.
Melissa, we're going to go to Ravit for a second. Before I forget to please put that resource that you were mentioning in the chat, because I'm
Yes.
sure the parents would be very interested. It sounds very delightful. I feel like we're just going to scratch the surface today, and then we'll bring you back for a deeper conversation. So Ravit, shifting from why it matters to kind of practical advice, or how can we kind of move towards that direction of bringing that in, especially what Melissa talked about, and I think in a way Chris and Candace are talking about, is, you know, the agency, the work that I do. You know, when Melissa, you were offering advice, I was thinking, oh, maybe our CEOs and tech workers would be so much better if they had, you know, you trained them, and you know, they would have this sense of responsibility about them. So Ravit,
Next generation.
so Ravit, how are you, because you're kind of putting this in practice, taking this sort of understanding you have about the body and the importance of mind and body working together, and to find their own worth and value for the children and for parents who are just frazzled running around everywhere. How are you kind of either using this platform that you have, or learning from it that you think, you know, could offer parents some advice on how we could navigate this way of finding our agency and connecting to our body, even while we are over subscribing to media, online?
So a lot of the books that we use, really, it's interesting. There's a lot of perfectionism and how unrealistic it is. And it's lovely to see it in so many different books and so many different cultures. And it like almost brings us together as humanistic characteristics, whether it's like an anthropomorphic animal that's struggling, or if it's something else along those lines. I think it's also trying to teach self-compassion, and it's okay. Nothing is perfect. I feel like a lot of times people want a perfect balance, and truthfully, even if we were standing and we were in perfect balance and perfect spine formation, and you know, cervical spines over the thoracic, and we have this great alignment, we have to move forward. And when you move forward or back or to the side, because you move three-dimensionally, you go off balance, and then you're able to kind of figure out, oh, this is how I go back on balance. And I think if we move away from perfection as being this amazing bar to reach, and realizing, you know, we learn through our flaws, you know, it can be silly. When my daughter was very young, we watched I Love Lucy just because it was just silliness. And I feel like that's what's missing with connection right now, because we're all always in this to-do list, and it's just exhausting. And I think that's why people do like to watch series on Netflix for a whole, because you just need to just shut off that part of your mind. One thing I will say that's been really interesting is that we've also been incorporating sign language. And even though it's American Sign Language, we're still using it with it. And when we do our stories, there is a lot of that engagement with the kids and with parents. Like, how many of us have ever felt like we were super clumsy? If you feel that way, show me that you feel that way. Yeah. And it's a lot of this connection that I think just brings people a little bit more together. And there's just one point that I did want to say that I find really interesting with storytelling, and this is why I have hope. And Melissa, I love how you said the next generation is. I think we are focusing so much on EQ, and I'm really hoping that my generation tries to find it for themselves, to model it for the next generation and even the previous generation. But I learned English from Sesame Street. My mom grew up in Kabul, Afghanistan, no education. She knew only one story that was told to her from her mom. When I told my daughter, I changed it a lot because there was a lot of things that just did not sit right with me on so many levels. And then I would tell her, but grandma heard it this way. How would you change it? To give her that freedom to kind of create it however she wants to be it. And Candace, before when you said you're a PBS child, it's exactly how I learned how to interact, was with Cookie Monster, was hearing things along those lines. And it really just shows how important diversity is and how you don't just see only one type of person on TV or any media or video games too.
So Ravit, I wanted to just remind everybody who's attending that your questions are very important. And we would be opening up in about 10 minutes. So please, they're just all good questions. So post them in, anything you want to know, and we'll be opening up about 10 minutes. And because I think the organizers are saying there are no questions yet. I'm sure there are many, and you're probably riveted by interesting talk that's happening here. So please do that. And then we'll move on to kind of the portions. So the plan is we'll open up for a few questions. Hopefully we'll have some more. And then everybody will have a chance to close. And there would be some resources that we either would post here or after the event that people can use, because we do want to give people relief. And so to the earlier point of, I think Ravit, you were saying, I think we sometimes, we call it at our household problem of over optimization. And in the Bay Area, it's just like, we're trying to optimize every minute. I've got this free minute. I'm going to do this. I'm going to cook with this hand, and I'm going to cut this with this hand. I'm going to teach you with that hand, and I'm going to kiss you. And in our household, our little one is the one who says, no devices. And when I tell her, oh, we're going to focus now, and then I go back to doing whatever, she said, Mommy, you're not focusing. And so I think maybe we go to Chris, you, and then come back to Candace on this topic. But I would love to see, on your site, I love that you had a place of saying, what are the ethical guidelines of helping someone? So could you kind of help the parents and educators? Because sometimes I don't think the children need as much help, but they just need for us to pause and listen to them, or just respond back with a question rather than start to try to over engineer their lives. But I was wondering if you had some thoughts here and practical advice you could offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I also, as an East Coaster, also can fall prey to the optimizing every aspect of my life and life hacking this and that and multitasking, despite the fact that I'm also mostly a mindfulness teacher in a lot of my life. It's pretty embarrassing. And I do think, so much of, what our kids learn, I talked about how, we all talked about how, the stories we tell reflect our values, right? And who and what we value in our society, but and that's where our kids learn, but they learn from watching us too. And, I remember when my son was born, talking to the pediatrician, I was feeling a little bit anxious because I just had a kid, and something about anxiety. And he said, I've seen a lot of anxious kids without anxious parents, but I've never seen any anxious parents without anxious kids. and just thinking about the importance of our own as parents, whatever we do for self-regulation, whether that's getting exercise, whether that's, kind of, mind-body stuff, whether that's mindfulness, which is a big part of my life, whether that's our spiritual lives, whether that's art and creating art, right? That we model that for our kids is so important, that we show up to them well-regulated. And it's okay to have conflict with our kids. It's okay to lose it. What's really important is that we model how we come back together in our relationships. We call that the repair. How do we make those repairs? That's actually really important for our kids. And so modeling, I joke about this in workshops I give sometimes, but we do a lot of breathing in my house because of mindfulness is kind of my thing. And like, you know, we do this thing at red lights. Whenever there's a red light, I'm like, oh, there's a red light. Well, I'm going to do a few deep breaths. And, you know, my son's like 6, so he's kind of gullible. And so he's just like, Dad, there's traffic. Can we do some deep breaths? Right. And I'm like, yes. Right. And it's like this kind of thing, you know, he'll catch on at some point, but like, you know, he'll already be doing it by habit and internalized it by then. But it's what we show our kids, right? Do we put our phones away? There's this great article that was like, being on your phone is okay as an adult. What you don't want to do is to like half on your phone, half paying attention. So say to your kid, you know what, I'm going to go do some emails. I'll be back in just a minute, right? And then come back and give them your full attention. It's this splintered attention that's hard. It's stressful for us adults, and it's really hard on our kids too. So trying as much as we can to kind of single task that stuff. And again, none of us are going to do this perfectly. I certainly don't do it perfectly, but you know, setting that intention day after day to, you know, I'm going to put my phone away when I walk in the door and not check it again for a while, or I'm going to tell my kids I got to go. I really have to answer this email right now, but I'll be right back with you, and then give them our full attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And we'll come back to you, Candace, but I have a quick question from Melissa in the middle, if I may. So I think, you know, Chris, what you said about self-regulation and modeling behavior is so important. Now, when it's kind of media, like games, some things that we haven't even used, Melissa, you know, like, so maybe we're not gaming to socialize, right? But we have our own, whatever our vices are, maybe we're binging on whichever our favorite platform is. What would you say, Melissa, is a way to think about how we help our children, how we manage sort of this media balance, which is one of the things I know you work on, be it how much time, or like modeling behavior, or looking at how we judge it, you know, how we make them maybe feel good or bad about it. Do you have any thoughts on that, or practical advice?
Yeah, and when I share the link later, there's some stuff that links to all kinds, I mean, because there's just so much out there. But one thing that I think of, and that I encourage our educators to share with parents in our district, is that Common Sense has a family media guide. And it's a great way that has some prompts for you to kind of question and think about what is important for you as a family, and how are you going to create that media balance. But what I really like about it is that it's doing it together. It's having that conversation with your child and coming up with it. Now, of course, you're going to scaffold that if you have really tiny little ones, you know, you're making more of the decisions about what that's going to be. But as they age up, I like to think that you come back to that media guide and address it every few years, so that you start turning over that ownership to them, because nothing's worse than having your kid go off to college and flunking out their first year, not because they're partying, but because they're instead gaming 24/7 because they haven't developed that self-regulation. So, you know, we really want to encourage our kids to help start developing those skills to monitor themselves, balance for themselves. And so I think it's through those conversations, and that media guide can help start setting up those parameters or those limits, and helps us as parents start thinking about it. And I think the other thing we have to remember too with us parents, we are not the digital natives that our kids are. We are digital immigrants. And so being that digital immigrant, we kind of have to cut ourselves a break, because it snuck in the back door on us, and all of a sudden it was just right there. And I beat myself up all the time, because I have teenagers and college age kids, about, gosh, if I should have done this differently. So, you know, just being okay, just, you know, letting yourself know you're doing fine, and just be more present, more aware of maybe things that you're doing with your kids, and helping them develop those skill sets specifically in this area. So.
Thank you, Melissa. And we're going to move to some questions that are starting to pop up. So Candace, I was going to ask you a question about if you select, or how you look at, especially with your petition, how do you look at labeling, which, you know, in our AI world, that's a very loaded term, because by itself, labeling can be biased. So, you know, it depends on who's doing the labeling, right? So I was conflicted. I like the intent of your petition, but I'm conflicted as to who's going to start to decide that. Because as soon as you put somebody at the gate, right, who's the gatekeeper and what's their decision criteria? But there was a question, I want to see if I can integrate it, by one of the attendees saying, can I find a place where somebody's pre-selecting stories, some sort of a stamp of approval, like these are okay, and a rubric to do that. And maybe you can tie it to 2 parts. One is, how would that fit in terms of, what's appropriate content? Maybe start there, and then I'll put the second part since we can go back to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I have a couple, I think, of thoughts on that. One thing that I can say is even amidst like thinking about advocacy and things, and I don't like to put an idea of like good or bad content in the sense of like censorship, because I don't think we should ever do that. And even content that like from, a psychological standpoint has been shown to be like an offensive or a bad representation, I think still within the story, there can be a lot of really good, even, moral or just entertainment aspects that we can take from it. So I think a lot of times when we're thinking about the kind of story is that any story can be great for your child. Rating systems and warning labels for me is more of a guide about what we can do as like parents and educators to have conversations with our kids. So those kind of warning labels can be like, hey, this is a heads up that maybe this will be a time for us to kind of speak with our kids about violence today, or about certain stereotypes today. Or you might have a story, a book, a TV show, a game where you don't really have to be confronted with those kinds of things. So a lot of times I think we might want to look at, what are we as individuals willing to expose our children to at a certain point in time? And then learning to kind of use, those tools of media literacy to think about ways, as Ravit said, that we can have fun with our kids and say, hey, what did you think about that? I think I would have had all the kids play together instead of being over here, and making it fun. So for me, it's always more about like just giving us a heads up as like parents and adults of saying, hey, this is something that's proven to be slightly problematic. So, be prepared to kind of point that out or to guide your child as you're watching it.
Thank you, Candace. And, Ravi, hopefully the resources that you'd shared about, how you're picking media, if you can share that, and anyone else who has it, because there's a question about how do we, select content. And a friend of mine who's actually on the call, Justina, had mentioned that there's some librarians who are actually helping, figure out when you describe, and there's some bookstores who do that, help you select a sort of content that's more customized for the child. A question came in, and raise your hand if one of the panelists, I don't know if I lost Melissa, wants to take it, but how do we control, the question is, how do we control young children, 2 to 3 years old, from over consuming media? And how do parents and educators know, like, what's the limit? Like, what's too much for that age group? Would somebody like to take that question? Or I think we lost Melissa.
Nobody would like to take that question. Sorry, go ahead, Ravit.
Ravi, yeah, please.
So I can only talk about it from a parent perspective. First of all, again, be kind and compassionate for yourself. What works today is not what worked yesterday. So please, if you need your kid to watch another episode of Daniel Tiger or whatever, Sesame Street, for you to have your cup of tea or coffee for sanity purposes, you're fine. Nobody's damaged from that experience. So I always tell people, please be super compassionate with that. I think it comes back to modeling the behavior. I think I'm a little bit of a traitor to my generation. I don't do social media. I have a 13-year-old who doesn't do social media. When she did get a phone, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of continuous conversation that happens. When she was younger, we had to make sure that we put our own devices away, which was, it's so hard to do sometimes. I mean, it's a problem. And I think.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, and we also have Melissa back. Melissa, the question was, what for 2 to 3 year olds, how do we determine what's a good, limit, and how much is, is enough for them?
Yeah, I saw that question just as, and I was trying to shoot something in the chat and hit the wrong button and poof, out of there. I was going to mention, Common Sense just came out with their recent report on 0 to 8-year-olds and their media use, and it's a little alarming, the influx and the growth from 2000 and I think 11 was when they started doing this report, how much it's increased. I think what's important and specifically what's come out is YouTube, and how features in a lot of our media has these things that hook us and pull us in to keep us there. And so as parents, we have to be a little aware of how can we set some limits in regards to, settings within the tools that our kids are using, so that it doesn't prompt that next video to come up. Those are some things that can be done to help with that. That goes back to what I was talking earlier about helping them develop self-monitoring. So, you negotiate as far as how much TV time or how much time are we going to spend on whatever media it is that you're using, and set those timers on, and then stick with them, and be consistent with it. I mean, that consistency.
One of the things we do in our household is 15 minutes of cleaning is 5 minutes of like a particular show, and that show is within a particular types of shows. And so I think for a 2 to 3-year-old, if you want to put things in chat, other strategies that those parents can have, I think that, you've seen work or resource they can leverage. I think it is very stressful time for parents because they're really trying to manage and kind of do the right thing, but they have very few breaks. And in between those breaks, they're kind of, like the parents are seeing everything, hang out, like they're in their vulnerable moments, like they're not getting to do that. So we'll move on to the next question. And I think we talked about it a little bit.
I just wanted to ask, Chris, I know I overspoke and I wasn't sure if there was anything that you wanted to share as well. I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure if there was anything else that you wanted to contribute.
Well, we'll send him the next question because we do have a few that we need to hit for 8 minutes. And then Chris can tell us a lot. Like we said, we can probably have him for half a day. So one of the problems that one of the attendees mentioned is that, this is a teen and they just don't know what they're navigating because they're so sophisticated, like you kind of used to know what they're looking at, but they're like going from a game to another media and they don't even know what's good or bad. So how do they kind of talk to them when, the teenagers already think the parents are not cool? So, how do they talk to them and influence them about something that they don't understand and in that age group? So Chris, did you want to take that one?
Lucky me. I think this is what's so hard, as people have been saying, sort of, digital natives versus, those of us that are adults. And it's like, I can't even keep up with like Twitter, let alone Snapchat and, TikTok and stuff like that. I do feel very lucky in my job as a therapist where I talk to teenagers all day. And so I get to ask them to educate me about what they're doing. And they're usually pretty honest with me, whereas I know that they're not so much with their parents. That doesn't mean that I go right to the parents and say, this is what your kid is doing, because of confidentiality, but that it helps me get to know a little bit about what some of the differences between these different things are, a little bit of what's going on, and encourage parents to talk to each other and encourage parents to talk to teachers who might be younger. Like there's a lot of cooler adults than us, as parents, and connect with those people, your kids' coaches, who might have a sense of what's going on in the group Snapchat with the team. If there's, something getting a little bit, intense, these kinds of other adults in our kids' life, if we're lucky enough for our kids to have some other adults, I think that can be really a useful source of information, because I know I feel out of it. My kids are quite young, so they don't know much about this stuff. And then I think also as we give kids technology, my friend Mark, who I actually should have suggested for this panel, Mark Burton, he talks about giving kids phones, and it sounds like folks are talking about this, like Ravit, like like a graduated driver's license with a car. It's like, here's the places you can go at first, and you drive with a parent, and then you get to go a few more places, and you don't drive after 9 o'clock, right? The car goes in the garage and the phone goes downstairs, not in the bedroom. And of course the wheels eventually come off all of this again, right? Because kids are good and they're sneaky and they want to get their phone, and we're exhausted to keep up with it, and we just try to keep bringing it back to that. But I think these are some strategies that can be useful, and to ask our kids, or to ask the siblings can be a really not, you want your kids like ratting each other out, but just like, hey, what is the deal with TikTok or this game or that game or this video game server or something like that? What's the reputation? And then I just can't say enough about Common Sense Media, which has so much good information on apps, on podcasts, on everything. And the fact that they have discussion questions, which I just discovered a few weeks ago, for after you've watched or read something with a kid. I just have so much respect for Common Sense Media and the incredible resources that they have. So that's a good just source. And they're so up to date. I can't believe it. It's like,
that was the thing I was going to bring up before I got bumped, was in the ratings and reviews, there's an area for parents of, things to prompt as far as conversation. So if you're kind of at a loss of what do I ask or engage my child with about this book or this movie or this app, it gives you some kind of guidelines of ways to maybe integrate and think about that. So.
Thank you. And I know we're about 4 minutes. We might stay 5 more minutes after, but I want to be mindful of everybody's over zoomed out time and on time. So there's a question that's right for you, Chris, if you don't mind taking it on chat, from Justina Austin, about how can we help kids sort of integrate and reduce stress and really build connections, because that's really ultimately what kids learn from. So if you don't mind taking that, I wanted to give last question to Candace, and then maybe have 1 minute closing, a very quick closing, like one little takeaway. So Candace, one of the things that I wanted to wrap up, because there was a lot of parent voices, you are one of the few content creators in this panel, which I was very excited to have you. How can we, for the media or tools that we don't understand, like games, how can we engage children to create this kind of mindful and very aware content where they can find their power and agency and self-worth, and really be critical thinkers of what they're consuming, and maybe better critical thinkers than we are? Do you have any comments or suggestions on that?
Absolutely. So questions are always really important. And thinking about, one is encouraging kids that thinking critically about things doesn't mean that we lose the enjoyment of them. It just means that we are gaining, more agency over the power that media has. So a lot of times it's really just prompting kids to ask questions about, what are the perspectives that I'm seeing? What are ways, exercises of having kids think about storytelling themselves? It could be based on something that's happened, or it could be totally based on their imagination, but really encouraging them to say, what is a way that I can make this story better? Or what would this story look like from a different person's perspective? Even I think so many people in the panel today talked about modeling. That's something even as adults that if kids see us doing that, they're going to also learn how to do it. So really just building that media literacy for kids. Something that I always like to do is just kind of reimagine things. What would this maybe look like from my perspective if I'm watching something that's not in my perspective? And so that really starts to kind of build not only good creative skills in kids, but also good skills of being able to take ownership over what they've watched.
Well, I want to thank everybody. There's 1 minute. Everybody for joining and making the commitment to be here. Our panelists were phenomenal. Before we end, I'd rather just each one, maybe we can go like a few seconds and just one thing that you kind of want to get out. And please, do post any resources here in the chat. If we get resources afterwards, or if attendees have resources, post them in the chat or share it with us, and we'll follow up with an email as well. So Ravit, any closing comments?
I think the things that stick in my mind is be compassionate to yourself. Take time for yourself. You can't give out of an empty well. So just just kind of check in with where you are and what you need. And I would, like everybody else has said, just model really good behavior as good as you can at that moment in time.
Candace?
Yeah, I would just say that remember that media is not the enemy so easily. It can be, but media is powerful and it actually has so many amazing benefits. It's just all about, you know, the kind of power that we give to it and the ways that we interact. But it is absolutely a fantastic tool when we use it the right way.
Chris?
I mean, yeah, just to echo what Ravit and Candace said. And honestly, I like, I joked about this in the panelist chat. I just want to keep hanging out with everybody. Like, you guys are all so interesting and I want to learn more from each and every one of you. But yeah, this has been a really fun conversation and far too short for me anyway. I just want to keep learning from everybody. So thank you. And I think, you know, like Ravit said, be kind to yourself. None of us as parents is doing this pandemic thing right and perfectly, and none of us is managing this screen thing perfectly. Not a single one.
That's a really good point. We can't even do it for ourselves. So, Melissa, and your thoughts?
Just echoing the same things everybody, you know, have grace on yourself and just remember, you just try it little by little, whatever you can do to help create that balance for yourself, balance for your kids in modeling that.
Great. And Candace, feel free to post your petition and, you know, maybe an email contact for people to reach out. Same thing for all the panelists. You know, any Googlers out there, we have some one pager on how to design YouTube class with some more responsibility that we'd be happy to share with you. Really, I'm just so thrilled. This hour went by really quickly. I hope you will come back for round 2. And so for the attendees, please send thoughts about how we could maybe make round 2 better and what questions we could include. And then with the panelists, if you're interested, we could explore maybe non-online ways that we could maybe bring some of your thoughts, combine it and turn it into resources for our community. Because right now we've got, everybody could use a little help. And Scott, did you want to say anything, or Beth, before we leave, to thank the speakers?
I would like to thank everybody for jumping in here. There has been so much. Yes, this could have been a 5-hour session. I'd like to thank the audience for their time, and please look for upcoming events at the Mountain View Center for Performing website, which is www.mvcpa.com. And thanks everybody for your participation here.
And I just want to say thank you to the panelists and the attendees. It was a phenomenal conversation. More to come. Thank you.
Have a great night and evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all. It was wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Great to meet everybody.
Great to meet everyone. Thank you.